The morning sun poured through the towering glass walls of the sleek office building, bathing the polished marble floors in a golden glow that stretched long shadows across the bustling lobby. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of authority. Sharp heels clacked against the tiles with unwavering confidence, leather briefcases swayed with purpose, and hushed conversations floated like whispers of power. Camille Bennett strode through this world as if she owned it, her navy-tailored dress hugging her frame with understated elegance, her pearl earrings catching the light with every step. She was a woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, a force of nature shaped by years of grit and sacrifice, her presence commanding respect in courtrooms across the city. Yet on this day that carefully built world would tilt on its edge, threatening to crumble under the weight of a single crushing encounter. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back. This area is restricted and you don't belong here." The officer's voice sliced through the ambient noise like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Camille froze mid-step, her fingers tightening around the worn leather strap of her briefcase until her knuckles ached. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, a wild rhythm of disbelief and rising panic. She had barely crossed the threshold of the lobby. Her lobby. The place where she'd spent countless late nights poring over case files, when this man, this stranger in a uniform, descended upon her like a hawk circling prey. His tone wasn't just firm. It carried a venom that made her skin prickle, a warning wrapped in disdain. "Excuse me?" Her voice emerged steady, but beneath the surface, a faint tremor betrayed her. She glanced around, her dark eyes darting from face to face, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. The suited figures milling about the law office paused briefly, their sideways glances flickering with curiosity before they averted their gazes and hurried away. No one met her eyes. No one slowed their steps. The silence swallowed her whole, leaving her stranded in a sea of indifference. The officer loomed closer, his broad frame casting a shadow over her petite stature. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a problem, a threat to be neutralized. "I said step back," he barked, his patience thinning. "I don't need any attitude today. Let's make this easy. Where's your ID?" Camille blinked, heat surging to her cheeks as she swallowed hard. "I work here," she replied, her words measured but edged with defiance. "I don't need to show you anything." The officer's lips curled into a smirk, his cold eyes raking over her from head to toe. He took in the crisp lines of her navy dress, the polished heels, the delicate pearls adorning her ears, details that screamed professionalism, competence, authority. But he didn't see any of that. Instead, his gaze stripped her down to a caricature, a stereotype that fit his narrow worldview. "You work here?" he scoffed, his tone dripping with mockery. "Doing what? Cleaning the offices? Delivering food? Because I don't think someone like you walks in here with a briefcase pretending to be important." Her breath hitched, a sharp stab of humiliation piercing her chest. She opened her mouth to fire back, to unleash the torrent of indignation boiling inside her, but before she could, his hand shot out. His fingers clamped around her arm, firm and unyielding, sending a jolt of pain up her shoulder. "Hey!" she snapped, wrenching herself free with a force that surprised even her. "Let go of me!" His eyes narrowed, and he hissed through gritted teeth, "Don't make a scene." But his grip tightened again, bruising her skin as he yanked her toward the exit. "Let's go outside. We'll clear this up real quick." "Let me go!" Her voice cracked, raw with desperation, and this time, heads turned. She saw their stares, some curious, some judgmental, most fearful. But still, no one spoke. No one stepped forward. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, suffocating her pleas. The officer's expression hardened. "You're under suspicion of trespassing," he declared, his voice rising with authority. "And if you don't cooperate, I'll have to take you downtown. Is that what you want?" Camille's mind reeled. "Trespassing? Are you serious right now? I told you I work here." But her words fell on deaf ears. He was already reaching for his radio, his thumb pressing the button as he muttered a call for backup. his eyes never leaving her, as if she were a criminal he'd caught red-handed. The air grew thick, oppressive, as the reality of the moment sank in. Camille felt her world tilting. The foundation of everything she'd built, her career, her reputation, her dignity, crumbling beneath her feet. She'd spent years fighting for her place in this building, in this city, in a system that rarely welcomed people who looked like her. And now, in an instant, it was unraveling before a crowd of strangers who didn't even know her name. She saw it in the officer's sneer, in the way his lips twisted with every word. This wasn't about rules or protocol. It was about power, raw, unchecked power, and he reveled in wielding it over her. Footsteps echoed across the marble floor as a second officer pushed through the revolving doors, his presence amplifying the tension. His eyes locked onto Camille, sizing her up with the same cold certainty of guilt. Her stomach churned, humiliation searing through her veins like wildfire, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to let the tears spill. Not here. Not in front of them. "Is there a problem here?" the second officer asked, his tone flat, procedural. The first officer jabbed a finger in her direction. "Yeah, she's refusing to show ID. Claims she works here." The newcomer didn't even glance at her before nodding. "All right, let's take her in for questioning. We'll sort it out later." "No!" Camille's voice erupted, sharp and forceful, as she stumbled back a step. But the first officer was already moving, his hand darting toward his belt, the glint of handcuffs catching the light. "This is insane! I am—" She didn't finish. Something stopped her. A tidal wave of rage, a suffocating sense of helplessness, and the bitter realization that no matter what she said, it wouldn't matter. Not yet. Not to them. She felt their hands on her again, rough and unrelenting, pulling her arms behind her back. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around her wrists, biting into her skin, and the crowd that had gathered, a mix of paralegals, clerks, and attorneys, scattered like startled birds. Whispers rippled through the air, gasps of shock, and one faint, trembling voice murmuring, "She didn't do anything." But it was too late. The officers marched her toward the glass doors, their boots thudding against the floor in a rhythm that drowned out her protests. She caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection, a woman in cuffs, head held high despite the shame clawing at her insides. They shoved her through the entrance, ignoring her warnings that they were making a catastrophic mistake. To them, she was just another nuisance, another body to process. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was who she truly was. Camille Bennett wasn't just some anonymous worker bee. She was a titan in this city's legal world, a judge whose name struck fear into the hearts of corrupt officials and seasoned attorneys alike. She'd grown up in a cramped Atlanta apartment, raised by a mother whose hands were calloused from scrubbing hospital floors, whose voice never wavered as she drilled into Camille the value of education, of resilience. Camille had listened. She'd studied until her vision blurred, graduated top of her class, and earned her way into law school on a full ride. By 30, she'd become one of Georgia's youngest judges, her reputation forged in steel, sharp intellect, unwavering fairness, and a quiet ferocity that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just her workplace, it was her battlefield, her legacy. And these officers, with their smug grins and iron grips, had no idea they'd just ignited a storm. As they hauled her away, Henry, the gray-haired security guard who'd greeted her every morning for years, watched from his post near the elevators. His weathered face twisted with confusion and guilt, his hands fidgeting with his cap. "That's Judge Bennett," he muttered under his breath, too soft for anyone to hear. He'd seen her arrive that morning, her usual warm nod replaced by a distracted glance as she'd adjusted her earrings. He wanted to shout, to stop them, but fear rooted him in place. Fear of the badge, of the consequences, of disrupting the fragile order he'd spent decades upholding. His silence gnawed at him, a regret he'd carry long after the echoes of this day faded. Outside, the morning sunlight glared down on Camille as the officers shoved her toward a patrol car. Her heels scraped against the pavement, her briefcase abandoned somewhere inside, a symbol of the life they were stripping from her. The crowd lingered at a safe distance, their whispers growing bolder now that she was out of sight. "Did you see that?" one young paralegal murmured to another, her voice trembling with unease. "She looked so composed, like she knew something they didn't." Her colleague, a wiry man with a stack of files clutched to his chest, shook his head. "They're going to regret this. Mark my words." And they would. Because when the truth clawed its way to the surface, when Camille's identity was finally revealed, the fallout would be seismic. These officers wouldn't just lose their badges. Their lives would fracture under the weight of their arrogance. She wasn't a helpless victim. She was a woman who'd spent her life dismantling injustice, and she'd turn this humiliation into a reckoning. Every stare, every whispered judgment, every second of that cold metal against her wrists fueled her resolve. She'd make sure they remembered her, not as the woman they'd dragged away, but as the force that brought them to their knees. But in that moment, as the car door slammed shut and the engine roared to life, a deeper question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. How do you prove who you are when no one believes you? How do you fight a system rigged to crush you before you can even speak? And what happens when the guardians of justice become the architects of your ruin? This wasn't just a tale of shame or prejudice. It was a raw, unflinching lesson in power, its abuse, and the consequences that ripple outward like cracks in a shattered mirror. Camille's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And when she rose from this, the world would tremble at the justice she'd demand, a justice that wouldn't just stun, but scar. A reminder that those who wield power without mercy will one day face its unyielding return. How far would she go to ensure they never forgot? As the patrol car pulled away, the answer hung in the silence, a promise etched in the fire of her unbowed spirit. Camille Bennett didn't have a spare moment to waste on small talk. Her day was a tightly wound coil, every second accounted for, and this particular morning carried an extra weight of significance. She was due in court for a case that wasn't just another file on her desk. It was a towering, high-stakes battle, one that could ripple through the state's legal landscape, reshaping how discrimination lawsuits were handled for years to come. Success could cement her name in the annals of justice, a legacy carved in stone. Failure, though, might as well paint a glowing bullseye on her back for every critic waiting to take a shot. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble of the courthouse lobby, a rhythm as steady as her resolve, when the atmosphere around her shifted. It was subtle at first, a hush that fell like a curtain, a prickle of unease dancing across her skin. She sensed him before her eyes found him. There, near the reception desk, stood Officer Bradley Tapate, his uniform pressed to perfection, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a medal of honor. He was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a jawline so sharp it could have been chiseled from granite. He looked less like a peacekeeper and more like a soldier itching for a fight. Camille knew men like him all too well, those who draped authority over themselves like a second skin, a shield to hide the doubts and frailties they'd never confessed to. As she approached the elevators, his head swiveled and their gazes collided. For a fleeting second, confusion flickered across his face, chased by something colder, something that tightened the air between them. He stepped forward, boots thudding against the floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You can't be in here." The words landed like a slap, but they didn't sink in right away. Camille blinked, her mind racing to catch up. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone steady despite the sudden heat blooming in her chest. Bradley's hand rested casually on the holster at his hip, a silent warning. "You don't have clearance to be in this building," he repeated, his eyes raking over her, lingering too long, too deliberately, until her skin crawled under the scrutiny. She straightened, her jaw clenching tight. "I work here," she said, each syllable clipped and firm, though inside a storm was brewing. She could feel it, the indignation, the disbelief, the slow burn of anger licking at her ribs. Bradley's lips twitched, a faint smirk tugging at the corner. "I'm going to need to see some ID." he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "Is there a problem?" Camille's voice sharpened now, a blade of its own cutting through the tension. "The problem," Bradley replied, his tone hardening, "is that you're trespassing on private property. I need you to cooperate before this gets messy." The lobby seemed to shrink around her, the weight of curious eyes pressing in. People paused mid-step, heads tilted just enough to eavesdrop while pretending they weren't. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she reached into her bag, fingers steady despite the tremor of rage beneath her skin. She pulled out her ID and thrust it toward him. "There," she said, her voice a challenge. "Satisfied?" Bradley snatched the card, turning it over in his hands as if it were a forgery he could will into crumbling. He frowned, then shook his head. "This doesn't prove anything. Could be stolen. You're coming with me." "No!" Camille snapped, stepping back, her breath catching as the word left her lips. "You're making a mistake." But before she could finish, his hand clamped around her arm, the grip bruising and sudden. Shock stole the air from her lungs. She yanked back, but he was already reaching for his radio, barking for backup. "Let me go," she said, her voice trembling now. Not with fear, but with a fury so raw it threatened to spill over. "You're assaulting me." Bradley didn't flinch. "I'm doing my job," he said, his tone flat, unyielding. Her heart thudded against her ribcage as a second officer strode into the lobby, his steps purposeful, his face unreadable. Camille's eyes darted around, searching for an ally, a witness, someone to intervene. But the crowd stayed silent, frozen in their cowardice. "You don't know who I am," she said, her voice low, shaking with the weight of every fight she'd ever waged to stand where she did. Bradley's response was a cold, cutting sneer. "I don't care who you think you are." The words stung, sharp and heavy, a reminder of every time she'd had to prove herself twice over. She wanted to scream, to claw back her dignity right there, but she swallowed it down. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, cold and biting, and Camille held her head high, her gaze locked straight ahead. Her jaw was a steel trap, her eyes blazing with a promise. This wasn't the end. Bradley didn't know it. None of them did. But Camille Bennett wasn't just a woman in a tailored dress. She was a judge, a force of justice. And by the time this nightmare unraveled, they'd all feel the weight of their mistake. They'd pay for every second of this humiliation, and she'd make damn sure of it. The patrol car jostled over uneven streets, the faint rattle of its frame a distant hum beneath the roar in Camille's mind. Her thoughts were a chaotic tangle, rage twisting with disbelief, humiliation knotting around every memory of the lobby. The handcuffs dug into her wrists, sharp and relentless, but she refused to wince. She wouldn't give them that. Her reflection stared back from the grimy window, her face a mask of resolve, though her jaw ached from clenching so hard it felt like it might crack. Up front, Bradley sat in silence, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror. Each glance carried a smugness that churned her stomach, a quiet triumph, as if he'd won something by dragging her down. The car veered onto a narrow side street, slowing as the police station loomed ahead, its squat brick facade glowing faintly under the morning sun. Camille had been in stations before, but always as the one in control, standing tall in courtrooms, wielding gavels, shaping fates. Now, stepping through those doors in cuffs, she felt exposed, raw, every layer of armor stripped away. The air inside hit her like a wall, thick with the sour tang of sweat and stale coffee, underscored by the faint buzz of flickering fluorescent lights. Officers moved through the space with mechanical precision, but one by one their heads turned. She felt their stares like pinpricks, but she lifted her chin higher, refusing to buckle. Bradley's grip tightened as he marched her to the front desk, shoving her forward with a flourish, like a hunter presenting a trophy. The woman behind the counter, a stocky officer with cropped hair and a bored expression, glanced up, her eyebrow arching as she took in the scene. "What's this?" she asked, her gaze dropping to the cuffs. "Caught her trespassing," Bradley said, his voice casual, almost lazy. Refused to show ID, gave me a hard time. The woman leaned back, a smirk tugging at her lips. Oh, yeah. Another one who thinks the rules don't apply. Camille's voice sliced through the exchange, sharp and unwavering. I want my phone call. The smirk vanished, the officer's eyes narrowing. You'll get it when we're ready to give it to you. Bradley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing murmur. You might want to rethink that attitude, lady. Things go smoother when you play nice. Her pulse roared, but she held her ground. I know my rights, she said, each word deliberate, a lifeline to her dignity. He chuckled, a low, dismissive sound that sent ice through her veins. You think this is about your rights? You're in my house now and I make the rules. The words landed like a punch, but she didn't flinch. Inside, though, the fire in her chest blazed hotter, fueled by every smirk, every nod from the officers watching like it was a show. She wasn't just angry, she was incandescent, a fury born from years of clawing her way up only to be shoved back down. Bradley pushed her forward and she stumbled, catching herself just in time. The hallway to the holding cells stretched out before her, dim and oppressive, its gray walls streaked with grime. The bars on the doors threw jagged shadows across the floor, dancing under the flickering lights. He stopped at an empty cell, swinging the door open with a clang. Inside, he said, stepping back. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, the weight of his stare pressing her forward. She stepped in, the cold metal bench against the wall the only break in the barren space. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and time blurred into a haze. Minutes stretched into hours, each one heavier than the last. Camille sat rigid, her back straight, heels planted on the concrete floor. Her wrists throbbed, her shoulders screamed, but she didn't shift. She stared at the bars, her mind a whirlwind of memories. Every late night studying law, every courtroom victory, every time she'd fought for justice only to find herself here, caged like a criminal. Footsteps broke her reverie, heavy and deliberate. Bradley appeared, keys jangling as he unlocked the door. Time's up, he said. Let's go. Her heart pounded as she followed him down the hall, into a small interrogation room where the next chapter of this ordeal awaited. In that moment, as the door clicked shut behind her, Camille vowed one thing. Justice wasn't just a concept she upheld, it was a weapon she'd wield. Bradley and every soul who'd stood by would learn that power misused carried a price, and she'd see it paid in full. The officer sat hunched over a weathered wooden table, his fingers drumming impatiently on a clipboard stacked with crumpled papers. He didn't bother lifting his gaze as he muttered, "Sit." His voice was flat, mechanical, like a man who'd long since stopped caring about the faces that passed through this dimly lit room. Across from him, Camille Bennett stood motionless, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The air between them crackled with unspoken defiance. I want my phone call, she said, her words slicing through the stale silence like a blade. The officer's eyes flicked up for a fleeting moment, his face a blank mask of indifference, before dropping back to the clipboard. You'll get it when we're done here, he replied, his tone as cold as the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. No! Camille snapped, her voice rising with a sharpness that made the room feel smaller. Now! Her demand hung there, daring him to push back. From the corner of the room, Bradley Tate stepped forward, his hulking frame casting a shadow that swallowed the faint light spilling from the single bulb above. He loomed over her, his broad shoulders squared, his presence a wall of intimidation. You don't get to make demands, he said, his voice low and laced with a menace that seemed to coil around her like smoke. But Camille didn't flinch. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze with eyes that burned with quiet fury. You have no idea who I am, she said, her words steady, unshaken. Bradley's lips curled into a smirk, a cruel twist of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. I know exactly who you are, he shot back, leaning closer until she could feel the heat of his breath. You're a nobody who thinks she's somebody. But guess what? You're not. The words landed like a fist, sharp and bruising, meant to strip her down to nothing. Yet Camille stood her ground, her posture rigid, her resolve a steel thread running through her spine. "When this is over," she said, her voice low but trembling with promise, "you're going to regret every second of this." Bradley leaned in even further, his face inches from hers, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're not in charge here. I am, and no one's coming to save you." His words were a taunt, a challenge, a declaration of his dominion over this moment. Before Camille could fire back, the door exploded open with a force that rattled the walls. A woman in a crisp navy suit strode in, her heels striking the chipped tile floor with the precision of a metronome. Her presence filled the room instantly, commanding attention without effort. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip. Bradley straightened up, his bravado faltering for a split second. "Ma'am, we were just—" he began, but she silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. "Save it!" she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the scene. She turned to Camille, her gaze softening just enough to reveal a flicker of concern beneath her steely exterior. "Is this her?" she asked, nodding toward Camille. "Yes, but—" Bradley tried again, only to be cut off once more. "Enough," the woman said, her tone final. She faced Camille fully now, her voice gentling. "Are you all right?" Camille nodded, but her response came out icy, edged with exhaustion and simmering anger. "I want my phone call." The woman gave a curt nod, as if the request were a formality she'd already anticipated. "You'll get it," she said, then pivoted back to Bradley, her expression hardening again. "Hand over your badge and weapon." Bradley froze, his mouth opening slightly as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "What?" he stammered, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You heard me," she said, unflinching. "You're off duty. Effective immediately." The color drained from Bradley's face, leaving him pale and unsteady, as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Camille watched the first fracture splinter through his carefully constructed armor, a crack that widened with every passing second. He sputtered protests, his voice rising in pitch, but the woman didn't waver. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers flanked him, ushering him out of the room. His face flushed crimson, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened, but he couldn't hide the tremor in his steps. Camille's eyes followed him as he disappeared through the door, her mind already racing beyond this moment. This wasn't the end. Bradley Tate wasn't the type to slink away quietly. Men like him thrived on power, and when it was stripped away, they lashed out harder. She could feel it in her bones. A storm was brewing, dark and relentless, and she needed to brace herself for its fury. As she stepped out of the station into the biting March air, the weight of what lay ahead pressed against her chest. The system Bradley served wasn't just flawed. It was rotten to its core, a tangle of corruption and unchecked authority. When the reckoning came, it wouldn't just expose that rot. It would tear it apart, piece by piece. And Bradley, he was about to learn what it meant to be powerless, to stand on the other side of the line he'd drawn so arrogantly. Weeks later, the courtroom buzzed with a silence so thick it felt alive, pulsating with the weight of what was about to unfold. Camille sat at the judge's bench, her back straight as a blade, her face an unreadable mask carved from stone. The room was packed, reporters crammed along the back wall, their pens scratching furiously against notebooks. Cameras lingered just beyond the double doors, lenses trained on the chaos about to erupt. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, their breaths shallow, eyes wide with anticipation. The air was heavy, suffocating, every rustle of paper or creak of a chair amplified into a deafening roar. But Camille's focus never wavered. Her gaze was locked on the man standing at the defense table. Bradley Tate, the officer who'd once clamped handcuffs around her wrists without a second thought. Bradley shifted uneasily, his once imposing frame diminished under the glare of the courtroom lights. His lawyer, a wiry man with a pinched face, whispered frantically in his ear, but the words barely registered. Bradley's cheeks were flushed, sweat beading along his temples, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for a way out. Camille could see it. The unraveling, the slow disintegration of the man who'd stood over her with such certainty that day in the station, stripped of his badge, his gun, his title. He was nothing now, just a figure drowning in the tide of his own making. The prosecutor rose, her heels tapping softly against the polished floor as she approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but edged with a quiet ferocity, "we are prepared to present our final witness." She turned to the gallery, her hand sweeping toward the back. "We call Camille Bennett to the stand." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Camille rose, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding. Bradley's lawyer leapt to his feet, his voice shrill with desperation. "Objection, Your Honor! This is highly inappropriate. Judge Bennett cannot testify in her own courtroom." Camille's eyes locked onto his, unwavering, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This is not my courtroom today. It is a place for truth." The words landed with the weight of a gavel, and Bradley shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening until the muscles twitched. The presiding judge, a stern figure with silver hair and eyes like sharpened steel, waved a hand dismissively. "Overruled. Proceed." Camille stepped down from the bench, her heels striking the floor with a purposeful rhythm that echoed through the room. The space seemed to tilt as she took her place at the witness stand, every eye pressing against her like a physical force. She folded her hands in her lap, her shoulders squared, and waited, the calm before the storm. The prosecutor stepped forward, her posture relaxed but her gaze piercing. "Judge Bennett, can you describe the events that occurred on the morning of April 14th? Camille's voice was steady, but beneath it ran a current of steel, forged from years of battles fought and won. "I arrived at my office building around 8 o'clock a.m. I was stopped in the lobby by the defendant, Officer Bradley Tate. He accused me of trespassing and refused to believe I worked there despite my repeated explanations. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. Bradley's lawyer shot up again, his voice trembling with indignation. "Objection, this is hearsay." The judge didn't even glance at him. "Overruled. Continue." Camille's gaze remained fixed on Bradley, her words deliberate, each one a stone dropped into still water. He grabbed my arm, ignored my protests, and humiliated me in front of my colleagues. I told him who I was, a judge, a professional, a person with every right to be there. He didn't care. He didn't even pause. Instead, he handcuffed me and dragged me to the station like I was a threat, a criminal. Bradley's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he lurched forward, his voice cracking with defiance. "You didn't say who you were!" Camille turned to him, and for the first time the fire in her broke free, her voice rising like a wave crashing against a crumbling shore. "I shouldn't have had to say who I was. My words should have been enough. My presence, my very existence, should have been enough." The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. Bradley sank back, his shoulders slumping as if the air had been punched out of him, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her truth. The prosecutor cast him a fleeting, dismissive glance before turning back to Camille. "Judge Bennett, what impact has this incident had on you?" Camille drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the flood of memories that surged to the surface. "I've spent my entire life proving myself, fighting to be seen, to be respected, to have my voice heard. I've earned degrees, won cases, upheld laws, built a career from nothing. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Not my title, not my accomplishments, not the years I've spent clawing my way up. None of it mattered because the color of my skin told him everything he thought he needed to know." A low murmur rolled through the gallery, but Camille didn't falter. She let the words hang there, heavy and unyielding, a mirror held up to the room. "And what do you want this court to understand about that day?" the prosecutor pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Camille's eyes darkened, her tone sharpening into something fierce and unrelenting. I want this court to understand that injustice doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It's quiet, insidious, a shadow that creeps into the cracks where people choose not to look. What happened to me wasn't a mistake or a fluke. It was a pattern, a thread woven into a system that thrives on abuse, on profiling, on power twisted into a weapon against those it's meant to protect. Bradley shot to his feet, his voice breaking as he shouted, "I'm not a racist! I was doing my job!" Camille stood too, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been simmering for far too long. No, you were protecting your ego. You were propping up a system designed to make men like you feel untouchable. But you're not untouchable anymore. The judge's gavel slammed down, a sharp crack that echoed through the room, but the tension had already ignited, a fire roaring out of control. Bradley collapsed back into his seat, his face ashen, his hands trembling as the reality of his fall crashed over him. The prosecutor turned to Camille, her expression calm but resolute. "No further questions, Your Honor." Camille stepped down, her heels ringing out in the silence as she walked past Bradley without a glance. The walls seemed to close in around him as she passed, his world shrinking with every step she took. He sank lower, his lawyer's frantic whispers a futile buzz in his ear. The truth had been laid bare, raw and unfiltered, and as Camille returned to her seat, the only sound was the faint hum of the courtroom lights overhead. Justice wasn't just a concept here. It was a force, alive and unrelenting, and it had come for Bradley Tate. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, carried a price, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this room, shattering the illusions of those who thought they could wield it without accountability. The relentless ticking of the clock reverberated through the courtroom, each second slicing into Bradley Tate's nerves like a sharpened blade. His leg jittered uncontrollably beneath the table, a restless rhythm born of dread, while his fingers clamped onto the table's edge with such ferocity that his knuckles blanched, stark white against the dark wood. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the room was cool, and his breaths came shallow and ragged. Beside him, his lawyer leaned in close, his voice a frantic whisper tumbling over itself in a desperate bid to steady his client. But Bradley couldn't hear a word. The lawyer's pleas were swallowed by the thundering pulse, hammering in Bradley's ears, a drumbeat drowning out everything but his own spiraling panic. His eyes flicked toward Camille, seated across the room, her posture rigid yet serene, her face an unreadable mask. It enraged him, her calm, her stillness. She should have been the one trembling, he thought bitterly. She was the one who'd been hauled out of that gleaming office building in handcuffs, her wrists bound, her dignity stripped away in front of her stunned colleagues. Not him. Yet there she sat, shoulders squared, gaze piercing, exuding a quiet strength that made Bradley's stomach twist. With every tick of that merciless clock, he felt the ground beneath him crumbling, the power he'd once wielded slipping through his fingers like sand. His lawyer's voice finally sliced through the chaos, low and insistent, carrying a sharp edge of urgency. "You need to pull yourself together, Bradley. If you crack now, it's finished. Everything we've fought for, gone." Bradley whipped his head toward the man, his eyes wild, his voice a jagged shard barely held together. "It's already finished. Don't you see it? The way they're staring at me, like I'm some monster they've already condemned?" The lawyer leaned closer, his breath warm against Bradley's ear, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "You haven't lost yet, but you've got to stop sinking yourself deeper. Trust me to handle this. Keep your mouth shut." Bradley's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding as he shook his head, defiance warring with despair. "She's lying," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "She's twisting it all. I wasn't after her. I was doing my job, following the rules." His gaze darted back to Camille, and for a fleeting moment, she turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Bradley froze, his breath catching in his throat. What he saw in her expression wasn't rage or triumph. It was worse. Pity. A quiet, cutting pity that sank into him like a blade, exposing the fragility he'd tried so hard to hide. The judge's throat cleared with a deep, resonant sound, pulling the room back from the brink of chaos. It jolted Bradley upright, his spine stiffening as he forced himself to draw slower, deliberate breaths, though his chest still heaved with the effort. The prosecutor stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, her voice steady as she addressed him. "Officer Tate, you've listened to the testimony. You've seen the evidence laid out before this court. Do you still stand by your account of what happened?" Bradley's throat tightened, his voice wavering as he pushed the words out, each one a struggle. "Yes, I do. I followed protocol. She wouldn't cooperate. I didn't do anything wrong." The prosecutor tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she pressed him. "Nothing wrong? You handcuffed a woman in the lobby of her own workplace, humiliated her in front of her peers, dragged her to the station without even bothering to confirm who she was. You don't see a problem with that?" Bradley's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached, his voice rising in defense. "I acted on what I knew at the time." "And what exactly did you know?" The prosecutor shot back, stepping closer, her presence looming over him. Bradley hesitated, his mind racing for an answer that wouldn't trap him further. "She was acting suspiciously," he muttered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. The prosecutor's lips twitched, a faint smirk betraying her disbelief as she pressed on. "Suspiciously?" She walked into her office building dressed in a suit carrying a briefcase and spoke to the security guard. "Tell me, Officer Tate, what about that screamed suspicious to you?" Bradley's eyes darted to Camille, then back to the prosecutor, his voice climbing with desperation. "She refused to show ID, after I'd explained she needed to, after she acted like she didn't have to prove she belonged there." The prosecutor's gaze sharpened, her tone cutting deeper. Was her refusal suspicious, or was it frustration at being treated like an intruder in her own workplace? Bradley's voice rose, cracking under the strain. "It was defiance!" The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, her words deliberate and piercing. "Or was it a response to being singled out, profiled?" Bradley's hand slammed down on the table, the sharp crack echoing through the silent courtroom, his voice erupting in a raw, unfiltered shout. "I'm not a racist!" The room fell deathly still, the air thick with tension. Bradley's chest heaved, his breaths coming in harsh, uneven gasps as the prosecutor let the moment linger, her silence more damning than any accusation. Then, with a calm that chilled him to the bone, she stepped back and spoke again. "This isn't about how you see yourself, Officer Tate. This is about whether your actions, whether you meant them to or not, were fueled by bias. And the evidence says they were." His lawyer surged to his feet, voice sharp. "Objection!" The judge's gavel came down swiftly, his voice firm. "Overruled." Bradley leaned toward his lawyer, his voice a frantic, breathless plea. "Do something! Stop this!" But the lawyer's shoulders sagged, his eyes weary as he whispered back, "I can't stop what's true." Across the room, Camille's voice broke through the stifling air, steady and weighted with meaning. "That's the trouble, isn't it? The truth. It's the one thing you never thought you'd have to face." Bradley's head snapped toward her, his voice a venomous snarl. "You think this is about race? It wasn't about race." Camille's gaze didn't falter, her eyes locking onto his with unflinching clarity. "Then what was it about, Bradley? Because it wasn't about the law. It was about power, about keeping me in my place, or what you decided my place should be." His face flushed crimson, his voice breaking as he shouted, "That's not true!" But Camille's words cut deeper, each one a precise, unrelenting strike. "Isn't it? Because it felt true when I stood there in handcuffs, humiliated, powerless. It felt true when you ignored every word I said, when you looked at me and saw nothing but a threat instead of a person." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone within its walls. Bradley's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a single stern glance. Bradley's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal seeking escape. Camille leaned forward slightly, her voice unwavering. You had the power that day, the authority, the badge, the gun, and you didn't use them to protect anyone. You used them to intimidate, to control, and now with the truth laid bare, all you can do is deny it. Bradley's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, barely audible. I was just doing my job. Camille's response was swift, her tone resolute. No, you were abusing it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable, a thunderclap of finality. Bradley's lawyer sank back into his chair, his hands resting uselessly in his lap, defeat etched into every line of his face. Bradley's head fell into his hands, his fingers threading through his hair as if he could pull himself out of this nightmare. Camille didn't look away. She let the moment stretch, let the weight of her words settle over him until he felt the same helplessness she'd endured that day in the lobby, the same suffocating loss of control. The judge's voice finally broke the silence, firm and measured. We will reconvene shortly for the verdict. Camille rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, each step echoing with purpose as she left the stand. The gallery erupted into a low buzz of whispers, speculation swirling like a gathering storm, but she didn't hear it. She walked past Bradley without a glance, her head held high, her shoulders unbowed. The tempest had raged, and she had stood firm through it all, but she knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice, for accountability, stretched far beyond this room. Bradley's eyes followed her as she exited, his face pale, his expression hollowed out by the weight of his actions catching up to him at last. As the courtroom door swung shut behind her, the echoes of their confrontation lingered, but the scales of power had tipped irrevocably in her favor. Outside, the courthouse corridors hummed with restless energy. Camille's heels struck the gleaming marble floor with a steady, resolute cadence, each click a testament to her resolve. The weight of the trial clung to the air, thick and unyielding, as reporters swarmed just beyond the heavy wooden doors, their camera flashes bursting like lightning in a storm-charged sky. She didn't falter, didn't slow. Her steps were purposeful, her posture unbroken, though beneath her composed exterior, her heart pounded with a fierce, unrelenting rhythm. She'd faced trials before, personal, professional, emotional, but this was different. This wasn't just about clearing her name or salvaging her career. It was about justice, about holding a mirror to the abuse of power and watching it crack under the strain of truth. It was a reckoning, long overdue, and she'd seen it through. In the hallway, Bradley sat hunched on a wooden bench, his broad frame shrunken, his head buried in his hands. The swagger that had once defined him, the confident stride, the way he'd worn his badge like a crown, was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to fold in on himself, diminished and unrecognizable. His lawyers hovered nearby, their voices a low murmur of strategy and damage control, but Bradley didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, tracing the lines in the marble as if they might offer him an escape from the ruin closing in around him. Camille slowed as she passed, and for a brief, charged moment, their gazes locked. The fire that had once blazed in Bradley's eyes, the defiance, the certainty, was extinguished, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Fear. His voice broke through the quiet, low and ragged, barely above a whisper. You've ruined me. Camille stopped, her expression unreadable, a stillness settling over her like the calm after a storm. No, she said, her voice steady and devoid of malice. You ruined yourself. His eyes flickered, a shadow of regret passing through them, but she didn't wait to see if it would take root. She turned and kept walking, the echoes of their exchange trailing behind her like faint, fading ghosts. Inside the judge's chambers, she closed the door and let out a slow, measured breath, the silence wrapping around her like a shield. But her mind refused to quiet. It replayed every moment, the sting of the cuffs on her wrists, the cold indifference in Bradley's eyes, the weight of every word she'd spoken in that courtroom. She'd held her ground, but the cost had been steep. Justice had prevailed, but it was a bitter victory, tempered by the knowledge that the scars of that day, of power misused and trust shattered, would linger long after the gavel fell. The burden of her role pressed down on Camille like a physical weight, heavier than it had ever been, as she slumped against the polished edge of her desk. Her fingers clenched the wood tightly, the cool surface grounding her as the rush of adrenaline ebbed away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and the dull, persistent throb of the battle she'd just fought. Her breaths came shallow, uneven, as though her lungs couldn't quite catch up with the storm raging inside her. The door behind her creaked open, a soft intrusion into her solitude, and her assistant Mara slipped inside. Mara's face was a careful mask of concern, her wide eyes flickering with hesitation as she hovered near the threshold. "The press is out there," she said, her voice low and tentative, as if she feared disturbing the fragile stillness. "They're clamoring for a statement, Camille." Camille straightened slowly, her hands smoothing the creased fabric of her dress, a deep navy that felt too formal now, too stiff for the rawness of the moment. She drew in a steadying breath, forcing her voice to hold firm despite the tremor threatening to break through. "Tell them I'll be out in a few minutes." Mara lingered, her lips parting as if she wanted to say more, then hesitated again. "And Bradley?" she asked, her tone dipping into something cautious, almost apologetic. Camille's jaw tightened, a flicker of steel flashing in her hazel eyes. "He'll get his moment," she replied, her words clipped and resolute. "But today, this day, belongs to me." Mara gave a small, understanding nod, her dark curls bobbing slightly as she retreated, the door clicking shut behind her. Alone once more, Camille turned toward the wide window that framed the sprawling city beyond. The skyline stretched out before her, a jagged silhouette of glass and steel piercing the late afternoon sky. It looked different now, somehow, sharper, more vivid, as if the haze of her earlier naivety had burned away, leaving the boundaries between light and shadow starkly defined. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, a woman transformed by the day's events, though she couldn't quite pinpoint how. Her thoughts drifted to the faces in the courtroom, the onlookers who had watched her, some with pity, others with quiet triumph, as she'd been dragged through the very system she'd dedicated her life to upholding. What did they see now, she wondered? Did they feel vindicated by her victory? Did they cheer the tipping of justice's scales in her favor? Or did they, like her, still see the cracks in the foundation, a system that remained fractured, bleeding out despite her hard-won triumph? A sharp knock jolted her from her reverie, and she turned to see Elena, the prosecutor, stepping into the room. Elena's presence was steady, her tailored blazer and measured stride exuding a quiet confidence, though her eyes held a softness that softened the edges of her authority. She closed the door behind her with a gentle click and offered Camille a small, genuine smile. "You were nothing short of extraordinary in there," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something deeper. Admiration, perhaps, or respect forged in the fire of their shared struggle. Camille exhaled, a shaky breath that carried no relief, only the weight of lingering doubt. "Was I?" she murmured, her gaze dropping to the floor where the polished wood gleamed under the fading light. Elena tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly as she studied Camille's expression. "You didn't let him slip through the cracks. That's what counts." Camille's lips pressed into a thin line, her voice softening to a near whisper, threaded with uncertainty. "But what if it's not enough? What if none of this changes a damn thing?" Elena stepped closer, her heels clicking faintly against the floor, and placed a reassuring hand on Camille's arm. "You forced people to see him for what he truly is," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "That's where it starts. The rest, the real shift, it'll come with time." Camille nodded, but the knot of unease in her chest refused to loosen. She knew this wasn't the end, not for her, and certainly not for the countless others who would one day stand where she had, facing battles they never should have had to wage in the first place. The door creaked open again, and a new figure appeared, Bradley's lawyer, Judge Bennett, his lean frame rigid with tension. His tie was slightly askew, his sharp features pinched as though he'd been chewing on words he didn't want to spit out. "Camille," he began, his voice careful, measured. "My client would like a private word with you." Elena bristled instantly, stepping forward with a protective edge. "Absolutely not! That's out of line." But Camille raised a hand, silencing her with a quiet authority. "It's fine," she said, her tone steady despite the flicker of apprehension in her gut. "I'll hear him out." Elena's jaw tightened, but she relented with a curt nod. "I'll be just outside," she said, her eyes lingering on Camille for a moment longer before she slipped out. The room fell silent as Bradley entered, his broad shoulders hunched and his gaze fixed on the floor. The air grew thick, suffocating, as he stood there, shifting his weight awkwardly from one foot to the other. His once crisp suit was rumpled now, a faint sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, raspy, barely audible over the hum of the city beyond the window. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I need you to know I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to. My job." Camille's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through the space between them like a blade. "Your job was to safeguard people, Bradley, not tear them apart." His shoulders slumped further, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical blow. "I screwed up," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I see that now, but I can't undo it." Camille stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her gaze unrelenting as it bore into him. "No, you can't," she said, her tone icy but controlled. "And the people you've hurt, people like me, we're the ones left picking up the pieces of your mistakes. So what happens to you now? That's not my call. But don't think for a second that an apology erases the damage. Words are hollow unless you back them up with something real. You don't get to just walk away and act like this never happened." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as his voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it." For a fleeting moment, Camille's expression softened, not out of pity, but from the faintest glimmer of recognition that he was starting to feel the gravity of his actions. "Then you begin by listening," she said firmly. "By facing the consequences head-on and actually being better, not just promising you will be." For the first time, Bradley lifted his eyes to meet hers, and she saw something shift in him. It wasn't defiance or denial anymore, but a raw, unguarded acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. She could see the guilt etching lines into his face, the fear of what lay ahead shimmering in his gaze, but she didn't let it move her. As he turned to leave, his footsteps heavy and uncertain, Camille let out a slow, unsteady breath, her mind spinning. She had built her career on a bedrock of faith in justice, in the law's ability to right wrongs and restore balance. But now, as the echoes of the day began to fade, she couldn't shake the question gnawing at her. Was justice ever truly enough? Or did real change, lasting, meaningful change, demand something more, something harder, something that reached beyond courtroom victories and into the marrow of human accountability? Outside, the clamor of the press grew louder, camera flashes piercing the dimness of the hallway as voices shouted her name. But Camille strode past them, her chin lifted, her stride unwavering. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And as she stepped into the blinding light, she knew this was only the first chapter of a much larger fight. Meanwhile, across town, Bradley sat hunched over a chipped desk in a dimly lit office, his fingers drumming nervously against a cold ceramic mug. The coffee inside had long since lost its warmth, untouched and forgotten, but he didn't seem to notice. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie dangling loosely around his neck as if he'd abandoned the effort to appear put together hours ago. Papers littered the desk, scribbled notes, legal terms, and half-formed arguments that blurred into meaningless scribbles no matter how hard he tried to focus. The blinds were cracked open just enough to let slivers of sunlight slice through the room, but even that felt oppressive, as though it were laying bare every flaw, every misstep he longed to bury. His lawyer, A wiry man named Daniel, with a perpetually unreadable expression, sat across from him, arms folded tightly over his chest. Bradley could feel the weight of Daniel's stare boring into him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the desk, his breaths shallow and ragged. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until Bradley couldn't stand it any longer. When he spoke, his voice rasped like sandpaper, dragged up from some deep, hollow place inside him. "You think this is it, don't you? You think this is how it all ends for me?" Daniel didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair, his tone cool and precise, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "It doesn't have to be the end, but it will be if you don't start owning up to what's real." Bradley's head snapped up, his fingers tightening around the mug until it groaned under the pressure. "Owning up?" he spat, his voice rising with a mix of desperation and defiance. "What's real is that I'm being railroaded here. They're turning me into some kind of scapegoat. This isn't justice, it's a damn circus. She wanted to prove a point, and I'm the one getting crushed for it." Daniel leaned forward, planting his elbows on the desk, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate cadence. "This didn't just happen to you, Bradley. You're not the victim, no matter how much you want to paint yourself as one. You made choices, bad ones, and now you're facing the fallout. That's not a conspiracy. That's cause and effect." Bradley shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor, but Daniel didn't so much as twitch. "You think I don't know I messed up?" Bradley snapped, his voice cracking as it climbed higher. "You think I don't lie awake every night replaying it all, wishing I could take it back? I didn't mean for it to spiral like this. I didn't think—" Daniel cut him off, his tone sharp and unyielding. "That's the whole problem. You didn't think. You acted. You assumed. And you didn't stop to question a damn thing. Now you're sitting here fishing for pity like that's going to magically fix it." Bradley froze, his breath hitching as the words sank in like stones. He turned toward the window, his fractured reflection staring back at him through the slatted blinds. For the first time, the full weight of his actions crashed down on him, a suffocating pressure that threatened to grind him into dust. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered, more to himself than to Daniel, his voice barely audible. "But it did," Daniel replied, softer now but no less firm. "And now you've got a choice. Face it or keep running until there's nowhere left to hide." Bradley sank back into the chair, his frame folding under the burden of those words. The office seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in, the air growing thinner with every breath. He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't even know where to begin. Back in her office, Camille stood motionless before the window, the city humming below like a living thing. Her reflection in the glass was crisp, unflinching, but her mind was a tangled mess of doubts and half-formed resolves. She reached for the framed photograph on her desk, a faded image of her younger self, standing proudly in her first courtroom, eyes bright with the belief that she could change the world. Now that belief felt distant, battered by the day's revelations. She had won, yes, but the victory tasted bittersweet, tinged with the realization that justice alone couldn't heal the wounds left by those who abused their power. It was a lesson carved deep into her soul. True consequences, the kind that mattered, came not just from verdicts, but from the hard, unglamorous work of holding people accountable, of demanding better, of refusing to let the powerful walk away unscathed. And as she turned from the window, her resolve hardened. This wasn't the end. It was the spark of something greater, a fight she'd carry forward, no matter the cost. Camille's fingertips grazed the cool surface of the glass frame, tracing the edges of an old photograph that seemed to hum with memories. Her mother's smile beamed from the image, a radiant glow that felt almost alive, her arms slung around Camille's shoulders with a fierce, protective grip. Even now, standing alone in the stillness of her office, Camille could feel the echo of that embrace, the solid weight of it, the comforting warmth, the unspoken resilience that had steadied her through storms she'd thought she'd never survive. But today, that weight pressed down harder, a bittersweet ache that clung to her chest, and the strength her mother had given her felt like a distant whisper, slipping through her fingers the longer she stared. A sharp knock at the door jolted her from the reverie, snapping her head around. Her assistant, Mara, hovered in the doorway, her posture stiff, her eyes darting nervously as if she were delivering news she wasn't sure Camille wanted to hear. "He's still waiting outside," Mara said, her voice low and tentative, like she was testing the waters of Camille's mood. Camille exhaled softly, her gaze lingering on the photo for one last fleeting second before she set it down on the desk. Her fingers hesitated, brushing the frame as if reluctant to let go, but then she squared her shoulders, her spine stiffening with resolve. "Bring him in," she said, her tone clipped but steady. When Bradley stepped into the room, the air seemed to shift, thickening with an unspoken tension. He wasn't the same man she'd faced in the courtroom just days ago. Back then, he'd stood tall, shoulders broad with the arrogance of authority, his voice booming with certainty. Now he looked diminished, almost fragile. His suit hung off him, creased and rumpled as though he'd slept in it, his tie askew like an afterthought. Dark shadows carved deep hollows beneath his eyes, aging him beyond his years, and his steps faltered as he crossed the threshold, as if he wasn't sure he belonged there, or anywhere, anymore. He paused just inside the door, his hands twitching at his sides, his gaze flickering between Camille and the floor. "You wanted to talk," Camille said, her voice flat, offering no invitation to sit, no warmth to ease his obvious discomfort. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find his words. "I'm sorry," he finally rasped, the sound barely audible, a fragile thread of remorse dangling in the space between them. Camille's face remained a mask of stone, her eyes locked on him, unyielding. "Sorry isn't enough," she replied, each syllable deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. "I know," he said quickly, taking a hesitant step closer, his voice trembling now, raw with something that might have been desperation. "I know it's not enough, Camille, but I don't know what else to say. I can't undo what happened." His words stumbled over each other, clumsy and unpolished, but Camille didn't soften. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "No, you can't," she said, her tone steady but edged with steel. "But what you can do is stop pretending this was some innocent slip-up. It wasn't a mistake, Bradley. It was a choice. A choice you made because you looked at me and decided I didn't belong there, didn't deserve to be seen." Bradley flinched as if she'd struck him, his breath catching in his throat. He took a step back, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides. "I didn't," he started. But Camille cut him off, her voice rising just enough to silence him. "You did," she said, firm and unrelenting. "And whether you want to face it or not, that's the truth. You didn't see me. You saw what you wanted to see, what fit your little narrative, and you acted on it without a second thought. Now you're stuck living with the consequences." His shoulders slumped, and his voice cracked as it dropped to a whisper. "I'm trying to," he said, his eyes glistening with something raw, guilt, maybe, or shame. "But I don't know how." For the first time, Camille's expression shifted, a flicker of something softer passing through her eyes, though her voice held its edge. "Then start by listening," she said. "Start by actually seeing the people you've ignored for so long, the ones you've dismissed, stepped over, silenced. And don't you dare expect forgiveness until you've earned it, step by painful step." Bradley's head bowed, his frame seeming to collapse inward under the weight of her words. In that moment, Camille saw something she hadn't noticed before, a crack in his armor, a glimpse of vulnerability that made him look less like the untouchable figure from the courtroom and more like a man hollowed out by his own reckoning. He looked broken, worn thin by the realization of what he'd done. But Camille knew better than to let that sway her. Regret was a start, but it was nowhere near enough. Justice demanded more than tears and apologies. It demanded accountability, a price paid in full. As he turned to leave, his footsteps heavy and uncertain, Camille's voice stopped him cold. "Bradley," she said, calm but resolute. He froze, glancing back at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and dread. "You don't get to rewrite this story," she continued, her words measured but firm. "You don't get to play the victim here. But you do get to decide what happens next, so make it count. He nodded slowly, his eyes damp but steady with a flicker of determination, and then he slipped out the door, leaving her alone once more. Camille stood in the silence that followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands trembling faintly at her sides. The battle might have ended, but the war was far from over. Outside, the courthouse loomed like a monolith, its walls steeped in the tension of the past few days, as if the very stone had soaked up every shouted accusation, every whispered plea, and now pressed it back onto anyone who dared to enter. From her office window, Camille gazed down at the street below, where the crowd churned like a restless sea. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing like lightning. Protesters hoisted signs scrawled with fury and hope. Onlookers lingered at the edges, drawn by the promise of drama. She pressed her fingertips to the glass, the chill anchoring her as her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quiet, thoughts of justice, of power, of the cost of wielding it carelessly. The door creaked open behind her and Mara slipped inside again, her voice softer this time, tinged with hesitation. "He's back," she said. "He's asking to see you again." Camille didn't move at first, her eyes fixed on the crowd, letting the weight of Bradley's persistence settle over her like a heavy cloak. After a long moment, she spoke without turning. "Bring him in." When Bradley entered this time, his steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he were walking into a storm he wasn't sure he'd survive. His suit was neater now, the wrinkles smoothed out, but the exhaustion etched into his face hadn't faded. His eyes were bloodshot, shadowed by sleepless nights, and his hands fidgeted nervously as he stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. Camille stayed by the window, her silhouette framed against the gray sky, forcing him to bear the full weight of the room's silence. "I didn't think you'd agree to see me again," he said, his voice quieter than before, laced with a desperate edge that hadn't been there earlier. Camille turned slowly, her expression unreadable, a fortress of calm that gave nothing away. "And yet—" "Here you are," she replied, her tone cool but pointed. He swallowed hard, his fingers twisting together as he searched for words. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice faltering. "Do what?" she asked, folding her arms across her chest, her gaze sharpening. "Apologize? Fix what you broke? Or convince me you're not the same man who stood in that courtroom and stripped me of my dignity?" Bradley's breath hitched, and for a moment he looked like he might bolt, his body tensing as if poised to flee. But instead, he stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I know I don't deserve it. I need to say this, and if you want me to leave after, I'll go." Camille didn't respond, but she didn't stop him either. Her silence a tacit permission he seized like a lifeline. "That day," he began, his words tumbling out in a rush, "I keep replaying it over and over in my head. The way I looked at you, the way I spoke to you, it haunts me. I can't justify it, and I won't try to. But the truth is I didn't see you. I saw a problem I thought I had to fix, a box I needed to check. I saw what I was trained to see, what I've always been told to see, and I acted without thinking, without questioning, without listening. And it wasn't the first time." Her eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring behind them. "So this is a pattern," she said, her voice cutting through his confession like a whip. Bradley flinched, but he didn't look away. "It was," he admitted, his tone heavy with shame. "Maybe it still is. I don't know how to unlearn something that's been beaten into me for years, decades even. But I know I have to try. I know that doesn't erase what I did to you." "No, it doesn't," Camille interjected, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You didn't just humiliate me, Bradley. You erased me. You looked at me and decided I didn't belong, that I wasn't worthy of respect, of basic humanity. and you acted on that without a shred of doubt. Do you have any idea how many people live with that every single day? How many people walk through this world knowing someone like you might look at them and decide their story doesn't matter? His voice broke, a ragged whisper escaping his lips. I didn't understand before. I thought I was doing my job, keeping order, keeping people safe. But I wasn't. I see that now, and it terrifies me. Because if I can't trust myself to make the right calls, how can anyone else? Camille stepped closer, her presence commanding, her voice dropping to a low, steady hum that reverberated with quiet fury. That's the question you should have asked yourself years ago. You think this is about fixing yourself, about finding some neat little redemption arc, but it's not. It's about the people who didn't get to walk away from that station like I did. It's about the ones who never get to tell their side because men like you decided it wasn't worth hearing. Bradley's shoulders sagged, his frame shrinking under the weight of her truth. I want to do better, he said, his voice barely audible. I need to do better. Camille's expression softened, just a fraction, but her words retained their bite. Then start by owning it. All of it. Publicly. Completely. No excuses. No half measures. And don't do it for me. Do it for the people who need to hear it, the ones who've been waiting for someone like you to wake up. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, a spark of resolve flickering beneath the guilt. I will, he said, the promise hanging in the air like a fragile vow. Camille turned back to the window, her reflection merging with the restless crowd below. She could still feel Bradley's presence behind her, a shadow of regret and uncertainty, but she didn't look at him again. She listened as his footsteps retreated, slow and measured, the door clicking shut with a soft finality. A slow breath escaped her lips, steadying the tremor in her hands. She didn't know if he'd keep his word, if the fire of his guilt would last beyond the glare of the cameras or fade into convenient silence. But that wasn't her burden to carry. Her fight was bigger than Bradley, bigger than this moment. It was for the people outside, those angry faces, those hopeful eyes, those voices rising and falling in the wind. It was for the ones who'd been silenced by power wielded without thought, by choices made in arrogance. Justice wasn't just a verdict. It was a reckoning, a reminder that every action rippled outward, and those who abused their authority would one day face the weight of their own consequences. For Camille, the battle raged on, fueled by the memory of her mother's strength and the unyielding truth that some fights were worth every scar they left behind. The air outside Camille's office thrummed with a restless energy, a low roar that swelled like ocean waves crashing against the shore. She squared her shoulders, her posture rigid yet defiant, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The moment her foot hit the pavement, the world erupted. Camera flashes burst like lightning, a chaotic storm of light, while reporters barked her name, their voices overlapping in a frenzied chorus. She didn't shrink back, didn't let the noise rattle her. Instead, she lifted a hand, palm out, a quiet command for silence. The clamor softened, then faded, leaving only the faint hum of anticipation hanging in the air. I'm not here to dwell on what happened to me, she began, her voice cutting through the stillness, sharp and unwavering, each syllable laced with purpose. I'm here to talk about what comes next. The crowd leaned in, captivated, their eyes locked on her as she stood tall, unyielding. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that let it happen, a culture that shields it, and the people it abandons in its wake. Most of all, it's about what we do to tear it down and build something better. Her words ignited something, a slow ripple of applause that grew into a thunderous wave, enveloping her as she stood there, chin high, resolve unshaken. She knew the battle wasn't over, not for her, not for anyone. But in that moment, surrounded by the swell of voices, she felt the strength of not standing alone. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere had shifted. The room, once thick with tension, now carried a hushed reverence, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Camille lingered by the window, her gaze tracing the last stragglers outside, reporters packing up their gear, their tripods clattering faintly against the concrete. The crowd had thinned, their chants replaced by the distant murmur of traffic weaving through the city. The trial's echoes still reverberated in her mind, a haunting melody of raised voices and strained silences, but the weight that had once pressed against her chest was finally easing. She let out a slow breath, watching it fog briefly against the glass. Her reflection stared back, calm, resolute, a woman who had faced the fire and emerged unburned. This chapter was closing, or at least pausing. Earlier that day, Bradley Tate had stood before the court, a man diminished by his own reckoning. His voice had trembled as he read his statement, the paper crinkling in his unsteady hands. He confessed to his actions, admitted the prejudice that had fueled them, owned the wreckage he'd left behind. But Camille hadn't been satisfied with words alone. She'd demanded more, something tangible, a reckoning with teeth, and Bradley had agreed. He'd resigned from the police force, effective immediately, and pledged to devote himself to organizations pushing for reform, training programs to root out bias, to dismantle the rot he'd once embodied. It wasn't enough to undo the past, she knew that. The scars he'd carved wouldn't fade with promises. But it was a beginning, a fragile step toward something less broken, even if the road ahead remained shrouded in doubt. She'd watched him leave the courthouse after the final ruling, his silhouette a stark contrast to the man he'd once been. His shoulders slumped, his steps dragged, as if the weight of his own shame had finally settled into his bones. Yet there was something else in his eyes, a glint, faint but undeniable, a spark of resolve born from staring into the mirror of his own failures. Camille didn't know if he'd keep his word, didn't know if he'd falter under the pressure of his own redemption. But that wasn't her load to bear. She'd fought her fight, laid bare the truth, and now it was his turn to carry the consequences. Alone at her bench, she ran her fingers over the smooth, polished wood, its cool surface grounding her. This courtroom had always loomed large in her mind, a bastion of power, a monument to order. But now it felt different, transformed by what she'd endured within its walls. It stood as a testament to accountability, a fragile reminder of how justice could crumble when no one dared to hold it steady. She'd stared down the very system she'd vowed to uphold, refusing to let it devour her spirit. As she gathered her things to leave, a quiet strength bloomed within her, replacing the exhaustion that had lingered too long. Outside, the courthouse steps greeted her with another surge of sound, applause rolling through the air, cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies, microphones thrust toward her in a tangle of wires and expectation. She didn't hurry through it, didn't let the chaos sweep her away. She stood still, letting the moment sink in, then raised her hand again. The noise stilled and she spoke, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. This case was never just about me. It was about a system that's failing, about the people who never get their day in court, who never get to demand they be seen. It was about what happens when we stop turning a blind eye. Her words hung heavy, settling over the crowd like a call to arms. We can't heal what we won't face. We can't change what we refuse to challenge. And we can't build anything worth having until we hold ourselves and each other to account. The applause erupted again, louder this time, but Camille didn't bask in it. She stepped down from the platform, her heels clicking against the stone, and melted into the sea of faces, leaving the clamor and the spotlight behind. This had never been about glory. It was about justice, raw and unrelenting. Later that evening, she sat alone in her apartment, the city's glow spilling through the windows in soft, golden pools. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, calls, a flood of voices she wasn't ready to face. She ignored it, pouring herself a glass of wine instead, the deep red catching the light as she swirled it in her hand. Sinking into the couch, she let the silence wrap around her, a gentle shield against the storm she'd weathered. For so long, she'd been fighting to be heard, to be respected, to be believed. Now, with the battle paused, she felt adrift, unsure of what lay beyond the horizon. But one truth burned bright within her. She wouldn't stop. This wasn't an ending. It was a spark, the first flicker of something greater. Bradley's story didn't fade with the courthouse doors closing behind him. Weeks later, he stood in a sterile conference room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone, the faint squeak of feedback cutting through the quiet. The room was packed with officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions guarded. This training session was mandatory, but he could feel their resistance, a wall of skepticism he recognized all too well. It was the same one he'd built around himself for years. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and began to speak. His voice was rough, unguarded, as he laid out his story, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as a cautionary tale etched in the ashes of his own mistakes. He spoke of the power he'd wielded, the biases he'd let fester, the lives he'd upended. And as he talked, he saw something shift, subtle, fleeting, but real. A crack in their defenses, a sliver of doubt breaking through. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a seed, a chance for something new to take root. Camille never reached out to him after the trial, but she kept tabs on his efforts from afar. Not because she needed closure, but because she needed hope. Hope that people could unravel their flaws, could claw their way toward something better. Maybe they could. Maybe they would. This wasn't just a story of wrongdoing, it was a reckoning with power, how it's seized, how it's twisted, and what it costs to wrestle it back. Camille had chosen to rise, to fight, to shout when the world begged her to stay silent. In doing so, she'd shown that justice isn't a gift handed down. It's a demand, forged in the fire of courage and consequence. Her stand was a mirror, reflecting the hard truth that unchecked power breeds ruin, while accountability, though fragile, holds the promise of renewal. What she'd begun rippled outward, a lesson carved in the choices she'd made, and a challenge to anyone willing to pick up the fight.